first ripples of this new wave were forming on the other side of the Atlantic. While in Norway mainstream, the new wave of British heavy metal was beginning to attract a cult following in America, particularly around the San Francisco Bay Area. What would come to be known as thrash metal was now in its embryonic stages.
Motorhead started taking it in a different direction, so yeah, I mean, there were those influences too. I know that Motorhead had a lot to do with the heavier edge of what the Bay Area sound became. That started happening more towards the latter part of the 70s, started getting a hold of this kind of music, like, wow, where did that come from? What are these guys doing? And so, yeah, it eventually did start to have, influence on how we sounded and what kind of sounds we were kind of portraying.
I got introduced to that whole, the whole new wave of British metal stuff from a guy named Rich Birch. And he introduced me to Ron Quintana and a bunch of the local SF bangers, folks, and he turned me on to like Motorhead and Iron Maiden, Angel Witch, and all the stuff coming out of England before it was, anyone had really ever heard of it over here. And he introduced me to Ron Quintana, who started this fanzine called Metal Mania, and that's right when the scene was just taking off, and it was really hard to find stuff like that, music like that over here, because it's all imported and stuff. But there was a shop in the city called the Record Vault, and they specialized in like the metal stuff coming over from England.
The early thrash sound, like the groups like Slayer and Possessed, and Death Angel, early Metallica, Megadeth, those bands, what were they listening to? Obviously, they were listening to what was coming out of England. They were listening to Maiden and Priest and Sabbath. I mean, that's the Holy Trinity right there. And it's the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost of heavy metal. So, and then you have like Lemmy floating over all of them, kind of like in the ether. So you got those four, the pantheon of heavy music. And then they're in their own little towns, like the crappy little suburb Huntington Park, where Hanneman and Kerry King formed Slayer. I mean, that's as do-nothing and depressing a neighborhood as Birmingham was in the 70s. So you're sitting in your room, your own existential nightmare, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. If you're not going to college, you probably. But you've been listening to these records for the last decade. It's over 10 years since Sabbath released Black Sabbath. And you're hearing, Tony play. You're starting to write your own songs, and maybe it starts as covers. Slayer did Iron Maiden covers in the beginning, but maybe it spawns a new kind of way to interpret, and that's what happened with that music. Is in the Bay Area, what Metallica and Exodus, Death Angel, Laz Rocket, those groups were taking what they felt inspired them musically from the new wave British bands, and they were putting their own lyrical take on it. They were bringing it into a more domestic setting. It was anger, but it was our anger.
Venom and Motorhead were the kings before Metallica took over, and they're directly lineaged from new wave of British heavy metal. Directly. In fact, both Venom and Motorhead are considered new wave of British heavy metal bands, but they also became the fathers of thrash.
The roots of thrash metal have been pretty clearly identified now. At the time, it was kind of hard to know because it was a wood for the trees scenario. There were all these clubs with drunken bands falling over, who was playing thrash, who wasn't. who was playing punk, who was playing metal, who was playing new wave of British heavy metal, and so on and so on. Nowadays, you can pretty much pinpoint the beginnings of thrash metal to Venom's first LP, Welcome to Hell, which appeared in January 1981. You know, and you could pinpoint that, if you liked, as the birth of thrash. Before that, you had some sort of faster songs from people like Motorhead. Judas Priest did a song called Freewheel Burning. But I think in terms of the actual double speed snare and the elements of thrash metal that we recognise today, you could do worse than say, okay, Welcome to Hell, January 81, that was the first thrash metal album.
As compelling as these British influences were proving to be, one young aspiring musician had taken his fan worship to a new level. LA rock obsessive Lars Ulrich had become so enamoured with Diamond Head that he had travelled to Britain to meet them.
We were touring, so he just flew over from San Francisco. He was 17, I think, and came backstage at this gig called the Woolwich Odeon in London, 1981, and just introduced himself. Hello, I'm Lars, and you know, I've flown over from San Francisco to meet you guys, and we were all, you know, very impressed with that, because nobody had ever done that before, flown from America to see us, you know, a fan at least, you know. So we thought he was great, you know, brilliant. And we said, where are you staying and all that? And he said, I don't know, I've only just come from the airport. And so come and stay with us. So jumped in the car and drove home. Stopped at my house for a week, just slept on the floor, you know. I didn't have a double bed he could borrow or anything, you know. So he slept on the floor in a sleeping bag. I can remember Lars used to go to Pinnacle Records, I think, was a distributor, and he would go and buy 50 albums, you know, while he was in the country, buy, you know, as much new wave of British heavy metal as he could get his hands on. And he'd bring them all back to my house and we'd put them on and we'd listen to them and, oh, that's good, and you know, that's not very good. And we'd go through all these albums, and I was amazed that he was just such a fan of this scene, you know, and how he loved all this stuff, you know. So I suppose you know, I probably heard quite a few things through Lars at the time.
I thought I knew all the heavy music there was until I went and saw his record collection. Man, you're one spoiled kid, man. He had just a huge collection. Yeah. And I would just have these blank cassettes and spend days at his house just taping all of these bands I'd never heard of that, you know, had cool covers or, oh, that's ugly and scary. Yeah, I'd record them. So, yeah, he introduced me to a lot of that stuff that he brought over.
I wasn't aware I was influencing Lars, you know, when I met him, or for a few years later, really, till probably about 82, 83. He used to write, as I say, and say, you know, you haven't conquered the world yet, what's happening, you know, how's it going, and remember me to everybody and things.
Personally, I believe Diamond Head were the band who should have been the biggest of all to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal. However, thanks to the likes of Metallica and Megadeth, who picked up on what they were about, their legend lives on, because Lars went on to become who he is with Metallica. The name Diamond Head has resonated down the years, and they have become an enormous influence. They were very diverse, and they really had started to take on board Eastern influences and influences from other parts of music and the world that made them stand apart from everybody else at the time, because they had a tremendous potential to be a global band.
Back in his home country and full of musical ambition, Lars Ulrich and his new band would find themselves displaying their Diamond Head influence in the most direct way possible.
I can remember he wrote me a letter once that said, you know, I've formed this band, it's called Metallica.
My name is Donna Davis, and I'm here with Metallica, the hot new heavy metal band from LA. And let's have them start with their name and what they do in the band, and let's start with you.
James Hetfield, rhythm guitar and vocals. Lars Ulrich, drums and bongs. Dave Mustaine, lead guitar. Cliff Burton, bass guitar.
He said, you know, we do Diamond Head songs. And then, you know, I think there was that time that somebody like Paul Owen or one of their monitor engineers told me that they used to do like 6 Diamond Head songs in the set, you know, in the early days. And they wouldn't say this is a Diamond Head song, this is Am I Evil? They'd just go, do-do-do-do-do, and you know, leave the audience's imagination to presume that they'd wrote it.
Diamond Head have made a career, really, after the fact Metallica have covered so many of their songs, Am I Evil and Helpless being just 2 examples.
The first one I heard was Am I Evil, which was a B-side of Creeping Death. He sent over the EP 1984. It was on Music for Nations. So I just thought, oh, that's interesting, you know. Lars, you know, I obviously knew him from when he'd come over. But I just thought it was Lars's band had covered Am I Evil? How unusual is that? I didn't think, oh, Metallica have covered, you know, we're going to be millionaires. I just thought, great, you know, they've covered Am I Evil? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But, you know, their version, first of all, I thought it was a bit too, you know, aggressive, a bit too heavy and a bit too tight, and, you know, it was a bit, ooh, not quite as classy, if you like, as our version. So that was me, maybe because the vocal, you know, is not quite so fluid vocal style as our singer. I thought they did a good version. They didn't do a bad version. It wasn't like derogatory or anything. Then they obviously did it as well as they could. But I really didn't think they would become the biggest band in the world. I had no idea.
When we used to pick cover songs and record cover songs in the early days, we would sort of stay more within our own territory, our own parameters, and sort of pick all these sort of obscure British metal songs and so on. But now we realized with this project that we could be, and wanted to be, a lot more adventurous in the selection.
The development of Metallica's early incarnation was matched by the flourishing scene around them. Thrash metal was now on its way to becoming a genuine phenomenon, a sound and fury all of its own.
When it first started out, it was all about like who could be the fastest, you know? Crunching guitars and fast drums and vocals that you had to need the lyric sheet to figure out what the hell they were saying, you know?
Back then, I think what we were all trying to achieve was the technicality and speed along with it. Meets like the teenage angst, you know? Fast, punk-like, without being punk.
It became indigenous, you know, the garage bands. That's unique. I mean, they did, the garages in England were probably a whole different thing. I don't know what the setting was, but the neighborhood idea, you know, the going down to the corner to the shitty pub was probably like going over and hanging out in a garage in El Sobrante, where Les Claypool and Kirk Hammett used to teach each other riffs. And that's where it begins, man, in your hood with the people that are just as unhappy, just as angry, and just as motivated as you are.
Like so many influential music scenes, like grunge, which was in Seattle, like heavy metal, which really started in Birmingham with Ozzy, Sabbath, Judas Priest. Thrash metal can be really pinpointed to, first of all, to Newcastle, where Venom were founded. Certainly to the San Francisco Bay Area, to the extent that Bay Area thrash is the phrase we use when we're talking about the 80s metal explosion. Certainly in New Jersey, where you had Anthrax and you had Overkill. Certainly in Germany, where you had this sort of unholy trinity of Sodom, Creator, and Destruction, as well as a few other bands. And then you had sort of isolated pockets here and there. There was Artillery from Denmark, Sepultura from Brazil, Sabbath and Onslaught, and a few other bands from the UK. But really, when we're talking about 80s thrash, you really have to start thinking about San Francisco Bay Area. That's what we're talking about.
The prominence of San Francisco was clear when the members of Metallica moved there in order to record with new bassist Cliff Burton. Thrash seemed at once both a strange yet appropriate movement for San Francisco to be championing, especially given the existing musical heritage of the city.
You have to first to examine, like, sociologically what the two regions that divide California are. Northern California is the home of two great movements of music. The 60s, flower children, hippies. That movement in the Bay Area was the peace and love movement. So, the whole jam band movement started out of the Bay Area.